March 6th, 2000, at 4:30 p.m. Central Time. To this day, I remember living in a small town years after my family moved out of Chicago, and it was the first time I remember being really hyped up about sitting my big butt on the couch and watching a TV show. Before that day, an advertisement had been running on Cartoon Network, narrated by Optimus Prime himself, Peter Cullen. It was about 5 pilots that were the same age that I was at the time, fighting back against a tyrannical military force to defend their people. Now obviously by the title of this video, or for anybody who knows what I'm referencing, you can tell I'm talking about Gundam Wing. Yep, this series is one that I'm going to have to admit I have a massive bias on. Gundam Wing isn't just my favorite Gundam show, it's my favorite anime ever. The only animation shows, I mean Eastern and Western, that I think I enjoy more than this, and only barely, are stuff like Batman the Animated Series, Justice League Unlimited, the original X-Men the Animated Series, Spawn the Animated Series, and Spider-Man the Animated Series. And again, a lot of that stuff is stuff I grew up with. The only shows in general that I think I would rather watch over this one, given the option, would be something like The Shield, Sons of Anarchy, or Chernobyl. Now, I imagine the comments are going to come in with the usual lol shit taste, lol you like Wing, you're gay, lol boy band, so on and so forth. And let me hit you with a fun statistic. The Gundam pilots in this show have higher kill counts in combat than all of the Universal Century pilots not named Amuro Ray or Uso Irwin. I'm just saying, for a bunch of boy band members, they seem to be better pilots than most anyone who ever got in a Gundam. Just saying. Okay, silly insults aside, I really don't give a damn if somebody gets ass mad at me for liking this show. I will freely admit, when it comes to my favorite Gundam shows ever, I've got different tastes. I think that Wing is awesome, and my favorite Universal Century story is Double Zeta. But the funny thing about it for me is that liking Gundam Wing really wasn't a big deal for a good chunk of my life. I kind of feel like the worms started turning around the time that 00 came out, and people started getting more exposure to Gundam's Universal Century stories. It sort of became cool within certain circles around like 2008, 2009, 2010, somewhere around there, to hate on Gundam Wing because of an English dub that admittedly has some weak moments, mostly due to the fact that the dub was done on a shoestring budget, and there are some moments that look funny out of context. Now, I hate those particular takes, and I think they're a bit nonsensical, and I'm going to tell you why. First and foremost, just about every Gundam series has moments you can take out of context that are fucking goofy. There's things like Fat Goof in the original show. Then there's, in the original show, the Zeon soldier butt scooting out of a goof and down its leg. Then Camille in Zeta calling himself an autistic child. And then another clip in Zeta where it looks like Camille off camera punched Sarah in the vagina. And then you could do so many with Double Zeta that you could convince somebody that Double Zeta is a Saturday Night Live skit from beginning to end, instead of just like the first 10 episodes. The point is that something out of context is just that, out of context. Acting as if one thing presented out of context makes a show bad is just dumb. And as for the English dub, yeah, I'll freely admit it's got some moments that I would call Great Teacher Onizuka moments. If you've never seen Great Teacher Onizuka, go watch it, it's great. The thing is, its English dub is infamous for having a lot of VAs pulling double or triple duty due to the budget. There's even one scene where Steve Bloom is quite literally talking to himself. So what happens here is you'll randomly hear Kirby Morrow or Brad Swale playing a grunt soldier, then in the next scene they're voicing their respective Gundam pilots. In fact, there's one scene at the beginning of the show where Zex Marquise is talking to Brad Swale and Kirby Morrow because they're playing the extras, and lo and behold, there are 2 Gundam pilots in the show voiced by those 2 voice actors. Now, the title of this video is obviously in defense of Gundam Wing, and what I'm going to do is essentially break down what I like about the series, what makes the series work, and go a little bit more in depth on why it makes the decisions that it does and why I think they're effective. Not to mention, I'm also going to try to put the show in more of a comparative context to the rest of Gundam to try to make people realize how quality this show really is and why it is the way it is. The first thing that comes to mind is that we need to talk about that English dub. Tell me something. Is there an English dub that exists in the world of anime that is so low budget that had this much effort put into it, where you could really tell that the voice actors were doing the best they could with what they have? There's not a lot you can name, in my opinion, but here they really pulled it off, and they created a scenario where these characters really became what most people thought of with a Gundam pilot just through their voice acting alone. Our main 5 Gundam pilots are Hiro Yui, voiced by Mark Hildreth, Duo Maxwell, voiced by Scott McNeil, Troa Barton, voiced by the sadly departed Kirby Morrow, Catcher Rababa Winner, voiced by Brad Swale, who is also the voice of Amuro Ray, and Wu Fei Chang, voiced by Ted Cole. I honestly can't think of a team of VAs out there that really did such a great job of bringing their characters to life when they were probably being paid pennies. The Gundam pilots aren't the only ones either that are well cast. Brian Drummond is fucking awesome as Zex Marquise, and the charisma of Treize Kushranada wouldn't have translated as well as it did without David Kaye's phenomenal performance as the young military leader. There's a lot of great moments in this show, like Wu Fei's assault on Lieutenant Noin's base, with the infamous "because she's a woman" line getting dropped. But there's one bit of it that really goes into nailing the disgust of Wu Fei that I feel needs to be played, and also just because it's fucking gangster.
You saw I was a kid and you underestimated me. You're a weak soldier. I don't kill bleeding hearts or women.
The sheer fucking disdain from Wu Fei's voice actor alongside the body language of the Shenlong Gundam is fantastic. It fits perfectly. And then there's what might be my favorite scene in the entire show.
This is Treize Kushranada. Murdered Tubarov.
Sir!
Golly, that gives me chills. By the way, these sequences are both out of context. In the context of the story, they're even better. So yeah, acting like a few out of context clips of dudes having to pull double or triple duty as a voice actor doesn't mean shit in the grand scheme of things. The other thing that honestly bugs me is people try to say that the writing in this show is bad. Huh? What really bothers me is some people that say that also will praise shows like Gundam Seed and Witch from Mercury to high heaven. Again, what? Look, Gundam Seed is shit. I've done videos about why creatively it's a failure. I'm not stopping either. And The Witch from Mercury as a show, honestly, looking back on it, had 2 or 3 maybe actual characters in it who got development. It has tonal consistency problems all over the fucking place, and the writer clearly never settled on what he wanted the show to actually be. I plan on re-reviewing G-Witch at some point, but if you can't tell from that and what I'm saying and the tone of my voice, you could tell I'm not pleased with how that show turned out at all, because it showed so much promise. But anyway, saying that the writing is bad in Gundam Wing is just idiotic. You don't know what good writing is, in my opinion. The writing's very solid here. The problem that people have, and they won't admit to it, but you need to admit to it, is that this show's writing is different. There's 3 major differences that we have between Gundam Wing and most other Gundam shows that have been made up to this show's creation in '95. The first is that Gundam Wing is formulated like a stage play. The second is that it's basically the normal Gundam formula, but it's in reverse, which bothers some people. The third is that it's admittedly not as dark or grim as some of its predecessors like Zeta or Victory Gundam. Let's talk about that stage play element first. When you're getting greeted by the first part of Gundam Wing, you're getting narration to set the stage. And our narrator, voiced in English by Campbell Lane and Japanese by Akio Otsuka, is a pretty common recurring force that comes in to set the stage whenever we get what you consider a major change in the background of the story. Granted, this is largely because what we're covering is an entire year's worth of events in 49 episodes. This isn't a format you see in a lot of Gundam series before or after this. Now granted, there was a narrator for Zeta Gundam who popped in at the beginning and the end of episodes, and there was one in Gundam as well, but it was pretty rare that you actually heard him, and it was mostly at the beginning or the ending of each episode. By the way, the Zeta Gundam narrator was actually voiced by the same guy who did Master Asia, David Petit. But regardless, it wasn't used in the same method as Wing does. There's also how the show is presented. There's a good bit of monologuing and waxing philosophical during the course of the show that, having just rewatched the entirety of the original Gundam, you don't really get a lot of that in that show or in some other ones. Now, some people might not like that because they would prefer to have the character more just have a different type of dialogue, or maybe have a little bit more focus on a smaller group of people, sort of like the original show did. And I can understand that. But you can't say the characters in this show don't do enough by their actions to tell you what they are. It's just a very action-heavy show. This, in my opinion, though, is a bit of the stage play influence, especially Shakespearean influence. You get monologues from characters essentially giving you their worldview on a plate, and obviously the best example of that is Treize, who I'd argue is the most intriguing antagonist in all of Gundam, and easily the scariest because this motherfucker does not lose unless he wants to. This is the guy that Lelouch v. Britannia wants to be when he grows up, but nobody will be this goated. In fact, I could probably do an entire video just on Treize and his philosophy if I wanted to, but ultimately, I think that these speeches do a great job of fleshing out Wing's world, because you've got to be introduced to an entirely new timeline here. Plus, I will admit my bias here. I used to do stage acting when I was younger, before I started having major anxiety issues, so I love stuff like this. But yeah, a speech like Treize's on Rule and Control is fucking amazing, and it wouldn't be as chilling without David Kay's delivery of it, and we wouldn't get something like this, in my opinion, if it didn't have that stage play influence and that stage play formatting. I honestly do like to hear characters wax poetic about worldviews, whether it's in this sort of a context or even something like Apocalypse Now, where you've got Marlon Brando basically doing that for the character of Kurtz. It's a different context, but you get my meaning. I dig a good monologue. Meanwhile, some dorks out there would rather have Kakali is crying. Fuck off. Now we come to the whole Gundam in reverse thing. Basically what I mean by this is you don't get the whole young man stumbles into Gundam and gets thrown into a war with the colonies situation. Instead, this is a story about 5 child assassins / soldiers being sent in 5 Gundams from the colonies to wage a guerrilla war against an entire fucking planet. I can see why some people wouldn't like that approach because it's different and a lot of people just don't like change. They like a familiar format, which, by the way, I'm guilty of too. It's not like I'm giving anyone the finger here. I personally, though, think that Wing's format works well for what it's trying to do. And by the end of the show, it's shifted back towards the normal Gundam setup of how many Gundam shows end. So it's not like it's trying to be heretical or something, it's just a little bit of a flipping of the script to give it some variation from other shows that are out there. Some people can't get behind that change, I can. The third thing to mention is the grimness factor. So Gundam Wing needs to be put in context. It was produced in 1995, and the last television series that Gundam had done before it was G Gundam, another departure from Gundam shows before it, because the show before it, we have to remember and keep in mind as the context of, is Victory Gundam. Now, G Gundam is its own thing, and it's awesome. I'll talk about it another time. Both G and Wing have to be looked at through the context of Victory Gundam being published. Victory is, to put it lightly, the darkest Gundam series ever tone-wise. Even more so than Zeta or Iron-Blooded Orphans, and that's saying a lot. But between the low ratings that Victory got on television, plus the production issues that Tamino had that he's not too proud of, partially because he admitted he was up his own ass for half of the show's production, it really just wasn't a good time for the franchise. Now, I don't think Victory Gundam is bad, mind you. The first half of the show can be a very depressing slog, but the second half is some of the best Gundam ever. Either way, having something that dark and depressing didn't exactly have people excited for more of the show. At the end of the day, Gundam can really best be summed up as war is hell, buy our toys. You have to get people excited for more war is hell stories, and Victory just wasn't doing it. That's largely why both G Gundam and Gundam Wing are the way they are in regards to being action-heavy shows that are meant to have a little bit more of a wide appeal. Could Wing have been as grim as something like Zeta or Victory? Yeah, actually, there's some pretty grim stuff that goes on in the show, and some of its villains are absolute monsters. At the same time, not every Gundam show needs to be that dark. I mean, for fuck's sake, Tamino had to introduce a lot more levity in Double Zeta Gundam, just so it wasn't nearly as depressing to people, even though by the end of it, it certainly can be. In Wing, it's not really levity that gets injected, though. There is some, but rather, it chooses to focus more on philosophy, less genocide, and really kick-ass mobile suit fights. The fight between Zex and the Tall Geese and Hero and the Heavy Arms in the Arctic is one of the best giant robot fights ever. One thing I need to stress is I don't think that quality-wise, Wing is the best show in Gundam ever. Quality-wise, I think that goes to either Zeta or the original. I'm of the opinion that Wing is part of what I would just be considering the holy trinity of alternate universe Gundam, along with IBO and G Gundam. It's leagues better than Seed, which is not hard, and it's better than Witch from Mercury just by virtue of being a much more consistent show. That doesn't even go into the superior mecha design, which in a mecha show will always matter, I don't care who deludes themselves otherwise, and of course a superior soundtrack, which we'll go into the details of how all that came together later. Now, some of you might be screaming, Gundam X! I love Gundam X, and I will concede that the writing in X is better than Wing. But as an overall show, X is very lopsided. It's got a great story, and some great characters, but the aesthetics, which yes, do matter, which by aesthetics I mean mobile suit design, soundtrack, orchestral score, all that stuff, in regards to design and things like that, all of it's just weak as shit. Then there's the obvious comparison to Gundam 00. I've done an entire review of Gundam 00, and my opinions have not changed on it. It's a good show, but it's overrated. The second season is weak, and it overall struggles with originality outside of technology ideas. The film is really bad, and some of the mobile suits are great, some of them aren't at all. Now let's talk a bit about what Gundam Wing had going on behind the scenes. What exactly makes this show what it is? When you look at who was involved in the show creatively and how accomplished just about everyone that was involved was, you start to realize why this show was able to come together as well as it was, to be such a great cohesive package. Now the show itself had two directors. The first half of the show was directed by Masashi Ikeda, who had previously directed the first 19 episodes of Samurai Troopers, or known here in the West as Ronin Warriors. The second half of the show was directed by Shinji Takamatsu, who prior to the show directed 3 of the Brave shows in Might Guine, J-Decker, and Goldran, on top of having worked on other Gundam shows where he directed an episode of Zeta, a few episodes of Double Zeta, a few episodes of 0080, and was a co-producer of Char's Counterattack. He's actually got a crazy body of work too, because after this he directed Gundam X, he directed School Rumble, and the first 105 episodes of Gintama. The show was written by Katsuyuki Sumizawa, which, when you know this guy's body of work, you'll understand why it's a bit more action-heavy and can appeal to a younger demographic, because I will freely admit, this is a pretty shonen-inspired Gundam show. Sumizawa has been a scriptwriter on Cutie Honey Flash, Dragon Ball Z, Inuyasha, Macross 7, Yu Yu Hakusho, and sadly my least favorite anime ever, Naruto. But he didn't create the franchise, so I don't hold it against him. A job's a job, and it probably paid pretty damn well. Regardless, he's a writer that's done a lot of action-heavy shows in the past, so it made sense for him to be chosen here. He would also go on to write the manga version of this story called Glory of the Losers, and its prequel, Episode 0, which I definitely recommend if you're a fan of the show. It does skip some parts of the original story, but it fleshes out some character backgrounds to give some more context to people's behavior, especially Wu Fei's. Now granted, Glory of the Losers is in the Endless Waltz timeline, but how the timelines work with Gundam Wing it's complicated. They're not contradictory to one another in my opinion, we'll just put it that way. I plan on doing a deep dive of this show, oddly enough, so I'll go over that later. What I'll just say is that Glory of the Losers is a good companion piece for Gundam Wing, rather than something that you could expect to substitute for the show, because while it does have good action and does have some good background elements, it's a lot lighter on some character work that I wish they had kept. Now, what makes the writing work so well in this show is what I mentioned earlier. The characters are memorable. The 5 Gundam pilots each have very distinct personalities and backgrounds. Nobody feels like a clone of the other, and nobody really blends in with the furniture either, which is a problem that a lot of Gundam shows after this had with characters. There's a lot of folks out there who have watched Gundam Wing that can rattle off half the cast because they're so memorable, whereas they might struggle with other Gundam shows because they struggled with character portrayals. Not to mention, I've already talked about how awesome Treize is, and then you have who I consider to be the greatest Char Aznable clone of all time, the one that I would also argue is a better pilot than Char, in Zex Marquise. Though it's hard to argue who has the cooler mask, let's be honest, it's also hard to pick who has the cooler mobile suits. Now, grunt suits are grunt suits. Let's not count those. Let's say you compare like the Hyakushiki to the Tall Geese, or, it's kind of a tough choice for me. I love them both. Same thing with the Epion and the Sazabe. I'm actually curious who you guys think has the cooler suits. Throw that in the comments. It'll be fun discussion. As for the score of the show, it's done by Kyle Otani. He did Shadow of the Colossus. I don't need to mention anything else. If you know, you know. When it comes to soundtracks, I've always loved the approach that Gundam Wing had. Every single main Gundam pilot has their own theme, like they're a character in Street Fighter. On top of that, the rest of the tracks do a great job of selling how dire situations are, or hyping you up for what's going to be a really exciting episode. I mean, if you want to get hyped for anything in life, really just listen to Gundam Wing's soundtrack. It's just as good as the original shows or Zetas or Double Zetas, but it's so much more high energy. Then we get to mecha design. It's going to be a controversial take. I think overall, from the top of the mobile suits, the Gundams themselves, all the way down to the grunt suits, I think that Wing's mecha design might be the best in the series. And I'm not taking that statement back. There's other shows that also have great mecha design. The original, Zeta, Double Zeta, Char's Counterattack, all awesome mecha design. Crossbone, really up there too. Unicorn has some great design as well, but Gundam Wing for me will always be top of the heap. Now the Gundams of this show, they're all designed by Kunio Okawara, the legendary mecha designer who designed the original Gundam. Each one is meant to be a representation of a different area of the world, which definitely gives some great distinction between each of the suits. Then there's Wing Zero and Epion. Just fucking look at them, these suits are amazing. The other main mecha designer who did the Oz suits and also the Tall Geese is Hajime Katoki, who many of you out there, like me, who are Gunpla builders, are going to know from the famous Verka line of Master Grade Gunpla, which you're seeing some of mine right in front of you. He's also the guy who designed the GPO-3 from Stardust Memory, the Master Gundam from G Gundam, and was the principal designer on Victory Gundam. In this one, he's the guy, again, like I said, designed all the Oz suits, and there's a ton of great designs here. But the one that's going to stick out is obviously going to be the Tall Geese. I love this mobile suit so much I keep my Master Grade on my work desk. When I finish with my Tall Geese 2, which if I have finished it by the time that you're seeing this, there will be an image on the screen, these stay on my desk all the time. My Tall Geese 3 is actually with all of my wing kits. The other thing about Katoki is he's also the main mecha designer behind Endless Waltz. And it goes without saying that his redesigns of Deathside Hell, Sandrock Kai, Ultron, and especially the Heavy Arms Kai and Wing Zero are just as famous as the original designs. Heck, I'd argue most people probably prefer his design of Heavy Arms over the original, and a lot of people prefer his design of Wing Zero as well, though I love both of them equally. I don't like his redesign of the Wing Gundam though. I understand what he's going for with it, but it doesn't really vibe with me for some reason. It's probably the wings, to be honest. Oh, then there's the character designs as well. Those are done by Shuko Murase. Yeah, that Shuko Murase, who worked with Gundam director Yoshiyuki Tamino on F91 and Victory. Then he went on to be the director of Witch Hunter Robin, and then Ergo Proxy, and then Gangsta, and then Genocidal Organ, and then Gundam Hathaway. This is a series, when you look at the credits and you look at who worked on this, you understand why this show is so style heavy and why so many people find it so memorable. You have a lot of great talent on it. Now, I will say this, I also have my criticisms of Wing. And they are criticisms that I'm probably not the first person to levy against it, but just know that I agree with them, and I'm going to talk about exactly where I see the issues and where they come from. The first is obvious to anybody who watches it that there is a director shift in the middle of it. Not in regards to tone, more so just that it's highlighted by the fact that there's 2 recap episodes back to back. That's something I'm not a big fan of, but I can understand why it happened. Whenever I rewatch the series, I just skip them. The second criticism is that Relina as a character can be a bit annoying at first. And I understand that, but you gotta consider the context. She's written like a teenage girl, and all of those things that come with being a bratty teenage girl are a big part of the negatives and why people don't like her. And admittedly, they don't come across as stiff in the sub, the original Japanese, than in the dub. She's a stubborn brat as a character, but in all fairness, she's got a couple things going for her. The first is that when she sets her mind to follow her beliefs, she doesn't give up on them. The second is that She has good character development as the show goes on, once she finally snaps out of her bratty phase, which we can admittedly thank Lieutenant Noin for that. But the thing is, as it goes on, she takes challenges to her worldview on the chin and realizes that in the world that the characters have to live in, you have to be willing to look at the reality around you instead of just spouting stuff from a philosophy class expecting it to always be practical for every situation. But she's mentally tough. She's willing to face dire situations just to do the right thing. And I think that that's admirable. And it's interesting to see the character grow from how she starts to how she is at the end. She has an arc in the show that I like, but I can freely admit that I understand why at the start of the show she causes some people to tilt their heads like a confused German shepherd. Oh, fun fact, there's a weird myth that goes around the show that Hiroyui never tries to kill Relina even after he threatens her. He actually does try to kill her, but Duo Maxwell shoots him in the arm to stop him from doing it. People forget that happened for some reason. I don't know why. Another criticism that I have to admit is very valid here is the plot armor. Yeah, there's points in this show where the durability of a mobile suit seems to increase exponentially if a named character is in it. In some cases, it's a little exaggerated by people, considering I don't think you can compare the combat skills of someone like Hiroyui or Zex Marquise, two guys who fight Gundams and Leos in this, to some random Osmook that's probably only seen combat when combat is defined by stepping on some poor farmer's house in a third world country. And I hate to be that guy, but a Leo in Wing is not comparable to a Zaku 2 in the original Gundam. It's a beam-capable mobile suit that can be lethal in the right hands. I'd compare it more to like a ground-type Marasai or Nemo or something like that. Now, even if it was comparable to a Zaku 2, the end of 0080 shows that a grunt suit can give a Gundam a tussle in the right circumstances. Still, there are examples that make you go, wait, what? Like the Murder Tuberov scene that I mentioned earlier. Somehow Treize's Leo is able to tank gunfire that would shred any other suit just for the sake of the plot. There's probably a couple other instances that I'm forgetting, but I can see why someone would get turned off by that. The Gundams, though, are supposed to be stupid durable in this universe. Hell, now that I think about it, Gundams in this show tank hits that have shredded Gundams in other universes. It's kind of wild. To conclude, is the show for everyone? No. I can see why some people nowadays wouldn't dig it simply due to the fact that Wing really isn't your typical Gundam affair, let alone your typical anime. I mean, unlike most isekai out there, there are parts in this show where you might have to use your brain, and that's just not fair. Okay, that's me being mean. My defense of this show just comes down to that, yeah, it's flawed. Like everything. But some criticisms of this show are stupid. Or come from people with different tastes. The thing is, it's a show of maturity that you can understand that some people just have different tastes than you do. With that said, Gundam Seed and Seed Destiny still suck, and no, I'm not stopping. Before I go, of course, I want to thank all of you so much for watching this. If you enjoyed it, like, share, subscribe, the whole 9 yards. If you're interested in any of the comic book fare that I am working on at the moment, links for that stuff is always in the description. On that note, guys, I'll see you next time for a deep dive. But until that time, my name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla. Have yourselves a great rest of your day.